Welcome to the Mad in America podcast, your source for science, psychiatry, and social justice.
Hello, and welcome to the Mad in America podcast. I'm Micah Engel, a doctoral student in psychology at the University of West Georgia and a research news writer for the Mad in America website. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Bethany Morris to talk about her work utilizing Lacanian psychoanalysis and a critique of psychology's medical model, as well as socio-political issues ranging from the stigma of borderline personality disorder to what a psychoanalytic understanding of gender has to offer to contemporary social justice debates around sex and sexuality. Dr. Morris is a professor of psychology at Point Park's Clinical Community Psychology program in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Bethany began her graduate educational journey as a student in child and youth studies at Brock University in Ontario, Canada. There, she studied alternative anti-psychiatric interventions in early-onset schizophrenia as illuminated by children's literature, as well as issues around women's stigmatization and oppression in the context of borderline personality disorder. Morris is a transdisciplinary scholar whose work bridges literature, philosophy, history, psychoanalysis, and film studies. In recent years, her work has focused on using the ideas of French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan to gain a critical understanding of the oppression of women, psychology's medical model, and other issues related to social justice. Recent publications from Dr. Morris include the co-authored book, Subjectivity in Psychology in the Era of Social Justice, as well as her first solo-authored book, Sexual Difference, Abjection, and Liminal Spaces. Welcome, Dr. Morris. Glad to be speaking with you.
Thank you for having me.
You are welcome. First off, can you tell our listeners a little bit about your trajectory as a professor in psychology?
Yeah, so you mentioned I'm currently an assistant professor at Point Park University. This is my first year there. Prior to that, I taught at Lindsey Wilson College in rural Kentucky, and I received my PhD from University of West Georgia. Before I moved down to Georgia, I was in as you mentioned, Ontario, Canada, and Prince Edward Island, Canada. My undergrad I got at the University of Prince Edward Island, where there my original plan was to become a clinical psychologist and, quote unquote, cure people. And I was very fortunate to have a professor at the end of my undergraduate career there who helped me to really think critically about this idea of curing people of their mental suffering without considering the socio-political contingencies of that suffering. And so from there, I sought out programs that would reflect that, Brock University's Child and Youth Studies being one, and the University of West Georgia also being one of the few, and then now, of course, Point Park being another. And I really try to emulate that in my own teaching now to be a critical voice in this sort of omnipresent, diseased brain discourse. I began doing that in Kentucky with some really thoughtful and engaged students who were planning to go on to be clinicians. And now I'm trying to do that with an injection of psychoanalytic theory at Point Park University.
Thank you. So you work at Point Park now, and as I understand it, the program there is a clinical community psychology program. Can you tell us kind of what you're doing there and maybe what the program's like?
Yeah, well, the psychology program at Point Park is quite unique. We have a PsyD in clinical community psychology. So this uses evidence-based community research and interventions to address human suffering with an appreciation for social justice and humanistic ethics. We also have a master's in community psych, which takes a humanistic approach to the consideration of individuals and communities and draws on really broad theoretical interests like humanistic theories, existential theories, feminist theories, liberation psychologies. And the students in this program are really engaged in their communities and are very insightful about how they want to address inequality at different systemic levels. And then we also have the undergraduate program, which is, broader, but seeks to provide students with, the comprehensive background that in psychology that many programs offer, but also with this emphasis of these unique threads that we have in our graduate programs. We're also trying to get a PhD in critical psychology off the ground soon, which will focus on the ways in which psychology has contributed to systemic inequality, and then training future psychologists to engage with their discipline in a more critical and compassionate way. So I currently teach in the undergraduate and master's programs. And the interests and expertise of the faculty at Point Park are broad, and they're cutting edge compared to other psychology programs in the country. And I'm still quite new there, but my contribution has been primarily at the intersection of critical psychology, critical theory, and psychoanalytic theory, mainly helping students to learn and understand traditional psychology by asking how it has contributed to these issues of oppression in society, but also asking, okay, well, what can psychoanalysis offer us in our quest to think about the individual and the social as already like inherently implicated in one another. Freud is typically dismissed in psychology as being unscientific or problematic for his views on childhood and women, which I believe to be a very unfair characterization of the man, but as well as a dangerous dismissal of a theory that was never meant to be psychological in the first place. So my approach is, psychoanalysis at its very foundation undermines psychology and the hyper-objectivist approaches to studying human subjectivity. So that's kind of what I'm trying to do here at my position in Point Park.
Awesome. So it sounds like the program there has a lot going on. It sounds like some really important work. So you mentioned your work uses the ideas of Jacques Lacan, psychoanalyst. What is it about this approach that drew you into it?
I was always interested in psychoanalytic theory, and I remember being really frustrated when I got to my undergraduate psych classes and I was told that Freud had been disproven, because I thought that's what psychology was. And it bothered me that, psychoanalytic theory was always relegated to film and literature studies sort of dismissively, as if art had not, been providing this like really intimate mirror into the questions that had been motivating human existence for hundreds of years before psychology even existed as a discipline. So, but the reason that Lacan in particular attracted me was because of his conceptualizations of suffering. Because even though I didn't, go on to become a clinical psychologist, my concern is still about the nature of suffering. I was critically oriented before, as you mentioned, I started pursuing psychoanalytic theory. And so my conclusion was that, the contemporary diagnostic response to mental suffering was not only insufficient, but really harmful for the ways that it reproduces assumptions that suffering is something the individual owns and is responsible for, as opposed to like a more complicated constellation of factors, social factors, right? So, but that response and pursuing that line of thought still left me with the problem that, well, like individuals are still the ones suffering, and pointing to systemic or social factors does not always address that very intimate experience of suffering. So for example, everyone and anyone can tell you that the reproduction of untenable beauty ideals in the mainstream media may be a factor in eating disorders and extreme dieting. And that's, of course, a big problem. But that doesn't tell you about the ways that those ideals become infused with meaning for the person refusing food, or how those beauty ideals become really intricately woven with the language and ideas shared amongst the family the person is immersed in, for example. So Lacanian psychoanalysis, and I think this is so important if we're going to think about human subjectivity, does not ask what's wrong with the person. Instead, it asks, what question are they attempting to ask about life itself and themselves in relation to others? And then how have they attempted to answer it with their behaviors? And I think that opens up new ways of thinking about human suffering that the traditional medical model does not.
Okay, thank you. So it's about this kind of attempt to bridge the social and the individual. That's really interesting. So your work and your interests are at the kind of intersection of psychoanalysis and these broader social issues. What kind of work do you do from this kind of intersection?
Well, my work is largely theoretical and qualitative. For a while now, I've been primarily interested in issues of sexism, but also racism, particularly this idea from Eduardo Bonilla Silva. I think I'm hoping I'm saying his name right, but I'm probably not. That we have a society of racism without racists, and that many of the people who adopt ideologies and practices that would be labeled as sexist or racist usually do not identify them as such, even when they seem to be just blatantly so. We can critique this idea a little bit, but my concern following this statement is that analyzing social structures and behaviors can provide a lot of answers to questions about prejudice and discrimination. But I felt that there were answers missing on the part of the actors perpetuating the prejudice and discrimination. And I find that a lot of the psychological analyses of people who may be considered racist or sexist so unsatisfying because they're typically diagnostic or degrading. They cite mental disorders like antisocial personality disorder, or referring to psychometric tests like how people who are sexist may also be narcissist or something like that. And so I don't know if that's entirely helpful because it reinforces the authority of the psychiatric and psychological institutions. So psychoanalysis instead takes any behavior or thought and not only asks why, but it helps the person themselves to ask why and be curious about their own behavior, which then allows us to look at social issues not just in a purely descriptive manner, but rather ask what are the latent questions at work in these various discourses, the racist, sexist discourses. And this is where I'm beginning to situate my work. So I did this in my book where I looked at, a number of historical practices and discourses that harmed women, including like the witch trials, the borderline diagnosis, looked at transphobia, and asked, okay, let's assume that the people that are complicit in all these things are not just like evil villains or, just purely sadistic in what they're doing, but actual human beings struggling with something and something in particular when they're confronted with certain types of bodies or certain types of people. So I did that in my book. I'm doing that a little bit with some research on incel communities and MGTOWs, and also doing that a little bit with thinking about how we talk about racism and racist discourses.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so it sounds like through this Lacanian approach, you're really trying to get at the fact that, one, there's a close link between the social and the individual. Two, which is very interesting to our readers here, there's this attempt to kind of address people's suffering without it being kind of this top-down, psy-complex authoritarian model, which I think is really important. So thank you for explaining that. In your book, you argue for what you call a renaissance of investigation into film and literature. So does this kind of connect up with this issue of sort of almost a psychology for the masses, a psychology for the people?
I don't know if it would be a psychology for the people, but I definitely think it would be more so a different sort of encounter with human subjectivity. I believe that people who write literature, people who write films, they tend to have a better handle on the intricacies of human experience than most psychologists. And maybe that's because most of these representations of humans in art are not psychological, but rather psychoanalytic and philosophical, right? And so art has a way of speaking, to the various existential and unconscious experiences that cannot be adequately addressed in a traditional reductionistic sort of psychological approach. And in that, art also makes demands of you that modern psychology does not. It asks you to bring something to the piece, to question your own interaction with it, right? A great example of this recently is the new Chloe Zhao film Nomadland. If you've seen it, it's just a beautiful film that opens up way more questions and insights than it does fill in anything for the viewer, and it really kind of it gets at what I'm hoping to demonstrate in my book and in my other pieces, what art can do, Whereas with, by relying on the production of knowledge in psychology, you're essentially kind of killing the subject you're studying, right? You're pinning them down, you're dissecting them. And what this means from a psychoanalytic perspective is that you foreclose desire and interpretation on the part of the subject themselves. And so they can't be curious about themselves in the same way, which doesn't mean it's entirely useless. Traditional psychological approaches, rather, it just means that they're studying something different than they claim to be. They're studying different instantiations of mind, body, and behavior. Whereas art, in addressing this question of the psychology of the masses, both in its representation and in its confrontation with it, it evokes the unconscious and therefore, desire, human contradiction, suffering, and it actually lets the human subject emerge.
Very interesting. Thank you. So maybe diving a little bit deeper into some of the Lacanian approach, I'm curious about, because I know that you've done work on sex and sexuality and gender issues. So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about a Lacanian approach to these issues and kind of what that has to offer.
Yeah. So I address a lot of this in my book, right? My book actually comes, after spending a long time being concerned about how ideas about women in particular, or women in particular, like problematic women, get reproduced. And so I use Lacanian psychoanalysis to try and think about, what we call sexual difference, but trying to think from the other side, trying to think my way in from not so much men, but like a patriarchal subject, right? Which is not, of course, limited to sex or gender. And essentially, it boiled down to me asking, okay, how do we get to a point where we think X about this group of people, right? So, for example, it used to be believed that women were capable of producing monstrous babies, even if they could not control their emotions. There's a great excerpt in the British Medical Journal in the 1700s of a doctor explaining how his patient gave birth to a baby that looked like a frog after she was threatened by a young man who was going to throw a frog at her. And the assumption is that there's something about being a woman, in this case, being a pregnant woman, that makes her susceptible to all sorts of like monstrous and horrific fates. And we see this question about, Freud's old question, what does a woman want? In all sorts of representations in history. We see it in the witch trials. We see it in the discourse surrounding women who commit filicide, right? We see this in the representation of the femme fatale in like Fatal Attraction, for example, which is then re-represented in the diagnostic category of borderline personality disorder. And so I emphasize a concern about sexual difference because in many of these practices and discourses, there seems to be an implicit assumption that there's something about women, or, in psychoanalysis, we would call them feminine subjects, because in Lacanian psychoanalysis, there's not adherence to this biological imperative. There's masculine and feminine subjects that don't necessarily correspond to biology. But that there's something about these feminine subjects in which the knowledge of the time cannot hold. And so this follows much of what the French feminists were arguing, like Kristeva, like Irigaray, like Cixous. But instead, I'm trying to think through this phallic or patriarchal logic, attempting to create knowledge. Like, in short, like knowledge systems are reproduced to hold this anxiety of sexual difference, is what I'm trying to argue. And that in a number of cases throughout history in which you have feminine subjects whose behaviors or practices do not fit within the logic of that particular moment in history, or what Foucault would call the episteme.
I'm seeing the link between what you said earlier about Lacanian psychoanalysis is wondering about sort of what questions people have for life or toward life. And I'm seeing the connection here between the questions that society is asking of people, right? Or the demands that society is making toward people. So I'm seeing the link there between what you're saying and then this kind of general orientation.
Yeah, and that because so much of these the knowledge systems, right, whether it be medicine or whatnot, right, that it's produced through phallic logic that does not necessarily encapsulate all the people that it pertains to. And so you have this excess, right? And you can see this excess manifesting in what we're calling feminine subjects. So when religious ideology was the way in which we understood the world, all of a sudden you had this excess being represented in witches, right? Because there's this confrontation with what we're calling in Lacanian analysis, sexual difference.
So continuing this theme around social justice a little bit, I know that you've done some work with colleagues around sort of this issue of wokeness. And I'm curious if you could explain what a kind of Lacanian approach, what it has to say about some of the contemporary kind of social justice issues that we're collectively trying to work through.
Yeah, well, the book I worked on with my colleagues, Sebastian Grant and Chase O'Gwyn and Sakenya McDonald, was an investigation into how these ideas about social justice in our society may actually shape our subjectivity or our psychologies, right? So it's a book that looked at a number of perspectives. Lacanian analysis was definitely in there, but it also it looked at concerns about being woke as opposed to being compassionate and responsible to other human beings, where wokeness may be understood as a demand as opposed to an ethic of relating to others. And in this book, we each emphasize different concerns in the book, but I think you could say that the collective project was to engage with the discipline of psychology during a really important socio-historical moment of social justice, and asking how psychology has shaped our understanding of difference and relationality. And is this like the best we can do, basically? Are we reducing people to tropes and signifiers that correspond to different psychological notions of what human subjectivity is? Or are we engaging ethically and compassionately? And I think Lacanian psychoanalysis really hones in on that, especially with considering signifiers, right? Considering how we represent ourselves to other people and how people are represented to us. And then what do we do with that? How do we live ethically? And so wokeness is definitely a concern in our book, but not in the intention behind being woke, but more so how it is taken up discursively. And I'd say our book is more of a concern about how to promote socially responsible subjects in these different social institutions.
Thank you. That sounds like some really important kind of considerations of just how we're framing a lot of these issues. So I kind of want to back up a little bit. During some of your master's work, you've been critical of kind of mainstream psychology's understanding of borderline personality disorder. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I've been working on the concept of borderline personality since my undergrad. I had a really excellent professor there who grabbed hold of me and helped me shape some of my ideas about this. But yeah, I have a problem with the diagnostic category, but I also have a problem with the ways in which this term has really permeated our cultural discourse. And I don't think you can separate the psychiatric discourse from the cultural discourse, because that's not how knowledge works or is used, right? It permeates society, it shapes our understanding of different ideas, and then it reinforms those institutions. And so my issue with the term borderline really started when I would frequently hear it being used by people telling stories, usually about their ex-partner in a certain performative way. Notably, it was typically used by men talking about their ex-girlfriend, not always, but usually. And the intention behind it was always to convey that the man, had gone through something, right? That remarking that they had dated someone who was borderline, and that has cultural cachet. And I was really interested in how that was actually just a stand-in for the term crazy, right? And because, accompanying this proclamation that their ex was borderline, there was usually facial gestures or vocal intonations or something that was attempting to elicit sympathy or camaraderie, right? And so this phenomena made me think about how we can use signifiers or terms that have been authorized by different social institutions to say something or behave in a way that others would find offensive or inappropriate. So using borderline instead of crazy because it doesn't have the same, it doesn't index the same certain, sex assumptions. But I don't always think, I don't think that this is far off from what the diagnostic category attempts to do as well. Many other scholars, have called attention to the diagnostic criteria of the DSM-4 and how it pathologizes women for doing behaviors that would be considered totally acceptable if they were performed by a man. And in the fourth edition, right, it's even included that 75% of BPD cases are women. This disappeared in the fifth edition, of course, where they claim that they've solved the problem. But what I attempted to address in my book was that this can be this trend, this phenomena of the overrepresentation of women in the BPD category can be situated socio-historically, similar to the witch trials or monstrous births, and that the knowledge system of our time, of our episteme, is psychiatry and psychology. And thus, like, the monsters that we actually create are going to look like, well, psychiatric patients, or and the ways that we talk about those people that disturb us are going to be informed by those knowledge systems as well. So rather than talking about how a woman's desire or fear can imprint on her fetus and deform it and creates frogs, we talk about neurotransmitters and psychometric tests and scales. So I do not think that BPD is the only diagnostic category that does this, but I think it is a really great representation of how it does this in response to concerns about what is considered appropriate behaviors for feminine subjects.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm hearing a strong emphasis in your work on these kind of issues of how some people are kind of accepted within society, and then some people are sort of sectioned off as deviant, and they need to be fixed, cured in some ways. That's really interesting. So, kind of on that topic, I know that you're critical, and you've mentioned this a little bit. You're critical of the kind of medical gaze, which has been described by French philosopher Michel Foucault, and you, of course, talk about this in reference to the historical oppression of women. I'm curious about your current sort of thoughts about the medical gaze, and I mean, maybe how that intersects with some of your current work.
Yeah, Foucault has definitely been incredibly influential on my thinking, and the medical gaze has informed many of my critiques of traditional psychiatry and psychology. And I think it also relates to the work I'm doing with Lacan and Lacan's notion of the gaze, in which the gaze of another shapes like who you are, right? Like, so think of a child who frequently requests to be looked at, right? Look at look at me, right? Or the child who cannot seemingly escape the gaze of another, who's constantly surveilled, and how that may shape how one comes to experience themselves and conduct their relationships. So the gaze of another provides a coordinate for our subjectivity. And if we think socio-historically, we can see how the gaze from doctors or clinicians have really called forth different subjective possibilities. What's considered sick, what's considered deviant. And while this can be really restrictive, where I'm going with my work now, I think, is to also think about how often we demand the medical gaze to be turned upon us, right? Whether literally by a doctor or our internalized doctor, or through consultations with friends or websites. And the thing that I'm, thinking about is that we experience through that gaze, right? The question, I guess, is there a way to have that relationship to the gaze that is less oppressive? But I think that comes from addressing social issues, absolutely. But we also then have to consider the subject in the social who is asking to have that gaze turned upon them. And so I guess that would be my Lacanian addendum to Foucault's notion, which I would even venture to say that like Foucault himself probably accounted for. But it's going back to that, considering how the social affects the individual, and how the individual experiences the social and demands of the social, and how the ways we typically think of these things as separate is really problematic. That the psychoanalytic subject is always already social.
I mean, this is a really interesting question that you're bringing up, which I think is relevant to a lot of sort of contemporary anti-psychiatry, contemporary, MAD studies, contemporary service user movements, which is, it's not only professionals and authorities kind of imposing this stuff. There's also an aspect of people wanting something, wanting a way to understand their experience, wanting help, etc. So that's a really interesting question. Just as a final question, I'm curious kind of what is on the horizon for you? What are you doing next?
Yeah, right now I have a few things in the works that I'm getting excited about. We are in the middle of a semester, so right now my concern is grading and tending to my students, but I'm also going to get more involved in the APA's Division 24, which is the theoretical and philosophical branch. So I'm excited to be more involved in that. There's also, the psychology program at Point Park is in the final stages of getting, like I said, a PhD program in critical psychology off the ground, which will really draw on our already existing community clinical programs. And so I was pretty involved in the development of that, and I'm really hoping to continue to do that. I'm also working on some co-editing projects, right? So I'm doing a special edition of Awry Journal of Critical Psych, which looks at the intersection of critical psychology and psychoanalysis. And I also just joined a team to co-edit a book on existentialism and sexuality, which the chapters are coming in and they're super fascinating. So I'm really excited to be able to be a part of that. And then finally, I think in the very near future, I'm going to be putting a new book together on subjectivity in the Lacanian sense and dieting. So specifically looking at our neurotic relationships to food and dieting and the ways that gets exploited in our, contemporary culture with the diet industry. So that's probably within the next year, I'd say, is my next project.
All right. Well, you have a lot going on. Thank you for taking the time out to speak with us today.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for having me. I'm a big fan of Mad in America.
Thank you for listening to the Mad in America podcast. Visit madinamerica.com for more news, views, and updates.